Hi, Scott.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Okay, how are you?
I'm good. Let me introduce us. I am Robert Wright of Blogging Hits TV, and you are Scott Atran. Is that how you pronounce your last name? It is, right?
Atran.
Atran.
I'm Scott. Yep.
I've been mispronouncing it for years then. Possibly on Blogging Hits TV, because we've done this once before. It was a couple of years ago, I think. And the subject will be generically the same as it was last time, which is terrorism. You are an actual expert on terrorism. I mean, you're an anthropologist by training, and you're at the University of Michigan and also John Jay College, and also you have an affiliation in Paris somewhere, right?
Right. I'm Director of Research in Anthropology at the National Center for Scientific Research at Oxford University.
Okay. And also you wrote a very good book called In Gods We Trust, which was kind of about the evolutionary psychology of religious belief, I guess you could almost say. And
a book about terrorism.
What's that?
And a book about terrorism.
And a book about terrorism. And what's the title of that?
Talking to the Enemy.
Okay. So the context for this discussion is probably obvious to all. The Boston Marathon bombing. You just wrote a piece for Foreign Policy arguing that the media has reacted to this in a way that I think you would say makes future such acts of terrorism more likely. Is that fair?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good, fair consideration.
Okay, and elaborate on that thesis.
Well, most of these guys are young men for whom mortal combat with a band of brothers in the service of some great cause that gives them adventure and glory and meaning in life. It provides maximum esteem in the eyes of the world that they think, especially in the hearts of their fears. And jihad today is a heroic cause that holds the promise that anyone from anywhere can make a mark against the most powerful country in the history of the world. But because these would-be jihadis best thrive and act in mostly small, self-organizing groups within networks of families and friends, not in large movements or armies, their threat can only match their ambitions if fueled way beyond actual strength by publicity. So, whereas nations, for example, tend to avoid publicizing their wanton killings, whether it's ethnic cleansing or collateral deaths from drones, publicity is the oxygen that fires modern terrorism. So the more we publicize it, the more we give it oxygen, and the more likely we are to help terrorists terrorize.
Okay, and I guess people in the media would say, well, there's the public demand. Our viewers, we have the numbers to show that our viewers will watch this, our readers will read it. So is it really the media that's to blame, or who?
Well, it's not the media that's to blame, but of course the media looks and says, wait, okay, so take pornography or fast foods, right? So the way the pornography industry works is they tweak our evolutionary yearnings for, say, the appeal of sex and sexual characteristics, but it has no apparent value, fitness value. I mean, it's just, on a glossy page or pixels, but yet they manage to tweak and fire us up all the same, even though it has no adaptive value. Same with fast foods. Sugars and fats are all important for the functioning of the body. They're very hard to really get in nature, protein as well. Mm-hmm. And now in our society of abundance, the fast food industry and the soft drink industry is just able to fire these things until we can virtually explode. And you need a considerable amount of education actually to avoid falling in the pitfall. Well, the same thing is true with the way the media works. I mean, it works by sensationalizing, and of course, violence is a privileged stimulant for sensation. Violence and, of course, sex, the same as the pornography industry. And they'll use it any way they can to sell whatever they can. But here's the thing. It's true that in the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, the press was as scandalous and sensational as it is today. But there was a period during most of the 20th century where the press showed self-restraint and acted like a responsible social actor. It acted as a public service. To give you an example, Edward R. Murrow was in the White House when the Pearl Harbor attack occurred, and rather than scoop the story, he decided that it would be more prudent to wait until the president and his staff had decided upon some initial strategy. And throughout the 1950s and 60s, this was pretty much the case, and into the 70s. I mean, if you look at the average news story, for example, during the 50s and 60s, it averaged about 2 minutes 30, 2 minutes 40 seconds a byte, if you want. Now the byte's 18 to 15 seconds. Not only that, if you're a politician or you go on TV, you're actually trained to do 8 to 15 second sound bites and to repeat it 3 times within a minute. So the amount of information is greatly reduced. That is, the ability to deal with complexity is greatly reduced, and it relies on very simple, sensational emotions that are constantly repeated to sell their products. The other part is, of course, that the news service was fairly regulated and self-regulated as a social service, and with the advent of cable and video and internet and deregulation, it's just become a force in the market, and we're faced with basically what's a problem of comments. The real problem, I think, is the broader problem of collective action. And it's our common good to deny terrorist media exposure. But each media outlet in a competitive and unregulated market is tempted to break the compact by trumpeting the news.
Right.
So that's the bond we're in.
Yeah. And I think some would say that times, 2, 3, 4 decades ago, times were more conducive to self-restraint on the part of media. I mean, for example, in the 60s, the TV networks, they had been given this just cash cow of a virtual monopoly. I mean, Spectrum, there was very scarce spectrum, and licenses had been awarded to 3 networks. And they didn't face very stiff competition, and partly in reflection of that, there was actually their explicit agreement to to serve the public service and the public interest in some sense. And daily newspapers a couple decades ago, many of them had a dominance in their market, like the Washington Post, didn't have to fear competition. New York Times, maybe a slightly more crowded market, but pretty much dominated the elite niche. And in any event, people couldn't, jump from the New York Times front page to some other front page, readily. I mean, there was competition in the newsstands, but I think there is, part of it is just that there's a more competitive environment now, probably, and a lot of these media outlets feel they're fighting for their commercial lives. But I think you would say that that the government, in its reaction to this, has also fed an overreaction, right?
Well, there's this, powerful but maladjusted relationship between the political establishment and the media. They constantly feed off one another and have to respond to one another, and that drastically subordinates reason to sensation. I was at a meeting in the British Parliament when a deputy director of the FBI told me, look, if I advocated anything less than zero tolerance for terrorism, they'd have me hanging by my balls from the Dome of Congress.
Right.
Now, that's the only case where there's zero tolerance. I mean, no one expects zero tolerance in anything. I mean, epidemics,
right.
Wars, shooting of children in schools,
right.
Nothing, right?
Right,
and
in
this particular case,
just to clarify, Scott, I mean, you're not saying we should, take a casual attitude and tolerate, terrorism as if there's something wrong with it. But I think what you mean by zero tolerance is the idea that any incident of terrorism, even if it's like it, kills 3 people and it's the first thing like it in years, is considered catastrophic failure, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Here's another example. So there has really been nothing nothing serious done in prisons, despite the hysteria that our prisons might be breeding grounds for terrorists. But there was one case in Torrance in California where a former Black Panther and a member of a gang were in a cell together, and they decided that they were going to be jihadis, and they laid out their own jihadi plans. And when the gang guy got out of jail, he teamed up with son of a professor and a Pakistani immigrant, and they decided that they were going to rob some convenience stores to fund their jihad, which included things like hijacking planes to bomb Saudi Arabia and to blow up Israeli airlines in LA. Now, this harebrained scheme was discovered when they robbed their first store, or tried to rob it, and they dropped the cell phone. On the cell phone, when they picked up the cell phone, the local police saw this sort of, Ersad's jihadi stuff, and they called the FBI in. The FBI called in over 500 agents, literally took down all their agents from the entire West. At that time, there weren't many that were on counterterrorism, including from their St. Louis office up to their St. Louis office, to work 24 hours a day on this case of basically two nudniks who failed to rob a jewelry store. I mean, that's just crazy. And as Mueller himself said, the director of the FBI, that we had to force ourselves. And remember, between 2001 and the Boston bombing, there have been 4 or 5 attempts, all failed. But in that period, there's been almost a global meltdown in the economy. And Mueller said it was because we took all these guys off of other cases to focus on terrorism, domestic terrorism, that we took our eye off the ball with respect to white-collar crime, and we allowed the financial meltdown to happen. This is what he said. I mean, so it has disastrous results.
I hadn't heard that.
But that's just for our society. I mean, it actually does help create terrorists. In fact, it's the critical ingredient. I mean, think about it. Almost all the cases of homegrown terrorism are young men who self-organize. About 90% of terrorists who attack Western targets are from diaspora immigrant communities, in transitional stages of their lives. They're students, they're immigrants, they're between jobs, they're between girlfriends, they're looking for new meaning in life as they're just leaving their family. Very few have any religious education. They're born again into this stuff because they're sort of disaffected for whatever reason in their late teens and early 20s. And the ideology is almost always the same. That is, they join this sort of general protest counterculture against the perceived persecution of Muslims. I'll get into what that means in a minute. And if that resonates with their frustrated personal aspirations, they have a moral cause and outrage. And what they usually do, even if they are religious already, and by the way, this is the way the Muslim intelligence, the intel in Muslim countries catches them, they start yelling at the other protesters in the counterculture, saying, look, put up or shut up, you're doing nothing. All you're doing is sort of blah, blah, blah. We've got to act. And they're usually by this time expelled from the mosque because they're upsetting everybody, even the Salafi imams. And then they go off into their parallel universe. I mean, if you look at any of these groups, the Madrid guys, even the Hamburg guys that did 9/11, they go into their cocoon and they psych one another up. There are no cells in any of this. They sort of bounce off one another. And then after a couple of months, or even a couple of days sometimes, they'll come out of their cocoon wanting to do something. You usually don't know what to do at first. They'll come up with some hodgepodge of a plan. It's really organized anarchy. There's no set goals. There are not even set boundaries in people coming in and out of these things. And they have no planning for what's going to happen after or what could go wrong. I mean, really look at who these guys are. And the reaction to them, I mean, for God's sakes, in the Boston case, a global security alert through Interpol for 190 countries.
So you're saying when some young guy who kind of fits this profile and is maybe flirting with doing something like this, when he sees that he's watching this on TV and he sees, wow, there's a global security alert. All of Boston has been locked down. All of the media is preoccupied with this. That makes him more likely to want to do it.
Sure, I mean, there's, familiar stuff in sociology and social psychology on this. The Werther effect. David Phillips
Right.
named this after the character in Goethe's novel who, mimics the well-mannered and well-dressed gentleman who gets rid of himself in the way he's supposed to do. And we have this, copycat suicide. In fact, we have similar problems with media coverage of copycat suicide. But this, of course, is much more dangerous, terrorist contagion. But it's very clear that the media is perhaps the principal cause of copycat suicide. Otherwise, how would people even know about it? Again, the Werther effect. And there's also clear evidence that the strongest indicator of the copycat effect is how much media coverage a suicide receives. So clearly the media can reduce this kind of terrorist contagion. We wouldn't have $1 billion advertising industry in this country if people didn't think you could influence someone else's behavior.
Right.
I mean, it seems to be a no-brainer.
Yeah. And yet, if say President Obama had come out right after this and cautioned against overreacting and said, he would have had to have been very careful to do it in a way that did not invite vicious attacks from the right about his being, insufficiently outraged. Right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, the English have done this. The British have done this. They've really toned down their reactions.
Well, keep calm and carry on is a British slogan, after all.
Yes, yes. But, what did Obama come out with the day after? He said Americans refuse to be terrorized, and ultimately that's what we'll remember from this week. Believe that? And, I've got great beach property in Arizona to sell you. I mean, that's complete baloney. And then that's not enough. So you get guys like Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham, and McCain saying that these guys have to be tried as enemy combatants. This 19-year-old schlub, basically, he is being accused of terror with weapons of mass destruction. Talk about Orwellian language. That's what they officially charged him.
Yeah.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Right. I mean, the term loses all meaning. What will we call actual nuclear weapons now? I mean, the term had already been watered down, but in a certain sense, because chemical weapons are nothing like nuclear weapons. But I mean, geez, we have to come up with a new term for nuclear weapons now. If a bomb that kills 3 people is a weapon of mass destruction.
Look, I actually teach a course on apocalyptic mindsets and terrorism. And I've got, police, judges, just regular students, all sorts of people. And, they're not, they agree that this is a weapon of mass destruction, right? That means they've sort of bought into this. They're young. They don't remember what the threat of nuclear war really was.
Yeah.
And then I say to them, well, what about nuclear weapons? Well, they say that's also a weapon of mass destruction, but they don't see the disconnect.
Yeah.
And I think in the long run, that's really dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, because these guys are going to be the future policymakers and law enforcement agents and FBI agents and CIA agents. I mean, this is truly dangerous because nuclear weapons are truly vastly more dangerous than these kinds of things. And the problems associated with nuclear weapons, which are terrible and real problems, have to be treated in a completely different way.
Okay, so, I mean, suppose
Yeah.
somebody's watching us and they say, okay, suppose we could do that. Suppose we could dial down our reaction to these things. Is that all you would recommend? I mean, is that enough? Would the whole jihadist movement eventually fizzle out if we just were patient enough and didn't overreact in ways that exacerbate the problem? Or are there other things you would prescribe?
Well, that could be the case, but we don't know. We don't have enough case histories, studies, past examples to make sure to be sure. So you couldn't rely on that. Okay, but a good parallel case is the case of the anarchists over 170 years, over a century ago. So between 1870 and 1914, roughly. They managed to knock off the Tsar of Russia, the President of the United States, the Empress of Austria, the King of Italy, God knows how many French ministers, Spanish ministers, and whatnot, and cause havoc all over the world. And when Teddy Roosevelt made his first speech after he became president upon McKinley's assassination, he said, very much like George W. Bush said on September 20th, just after the 9/11 attacks, that this is the greatest dangers facing the world, the terrorism from anarchism, and that it is now the job of the United States to stop this barbarism anywhere in the world it occurs. It's almost exactly like President Bush's speech. And for the first time in U.S. history, he gave the right for the United States to intervene and actually said police anywhere in the world where no one else is willing to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it was only with the Warren Commission into the inquiry into the assassination of President Kennedy when it was finally recognized that there had been no terrorist international at all. There was no central command, even though the fact that the FBI, the Secret Service was upped, the Russian Okhrana, which became the precursor to the NKVD, and KGB, and Scotland Yard were set up to fight the anarchists. But again, there was no central anarchy, and they were committed young people, suicide bombers, without very few means, actually. Guns, pipe bombs, willing to kill one another, kill themselves, and the reaction was just overwrought, and it actually did change the relationships between the nations of the world and put us to a significant extent on the course the United States subsequently took.
Mm.
So these have huge, I think, geopolitical ramifications, not to mention the fact that, so for example, the terrorist attacks against the United States, including those in the United States, have totaled less than $1 million and involved, at the extreme, 400 to 500 people, most of them arrested, by the way, in entrapment cases by the FBI. We've spent over $4 trillion in reaction. In terms of the number of casualties and those killed by terrorist attacks, compared to those killed and the casualties caused by a reaction to the terrorist attack, we have similar orders of magnitude. So the whole thing is really is really crazy. Not to mention the terrorism industry, which now is a huge industry, huge part of the Department of Defense.
Right.
And it's really hard to ratchet down once you've ratcheted it up.
Yeah. And one question that's raised. I mean, you find, and we should say, you've studied this systematically. You have a team that's been in the business of assessing the profiles of the terrorists and the would-be terrorists, and you find that overwhelmingly, as you've said, they are not plugged in any kind of substantial way to some sort of international, command structure.
Right.
And yet a huge amount of our resources are devoted to addressing a threat abroad, right? I mean, it's certainly a lot of the fireworks, drone strikes and so on. Now, I suppose a defender of the policy might say, well, the reason you don't see terrorism that truly emanates from abroad is precisely because we're spending so much money fighting it at the source. But the fact
that's
is...
the white
sorry, go ahead. What's your reaction to that?
That's the white elephant argument. The woman standing at a bus stop waving her hands, and someone says to this lady, why are you waving your hands like that? She says, I'm keeping the white elephants away. The white elephants? There are no white elephants. She says, precisely.
Yeah, well...
I mean,
and then there is, the problem could go beyond a waste of resources, right? Because, and here I guess we get into the psychology of the people who do this, but they usually at least claim that their motivation has something to do with the oppression of Muslims abroad or some sort of, some sort of grievance on the part of Muslims abroad, often involving American action, including things like drone strikes, including these various things that we do based on the premise that the threat emanates fundamentally from abroad, right? What is you've studied the psychology of these people? Where does that figure in? I mean, do you think do you think that is a to what extent do you think that kind of thing actually has causal force?
Well, it's a little more complicated. First of all, we don't just study this stuff secondhand. We are in the field. I actually spend time in Mujahideen camps, and also with the families and friends and in the networks of these groups like the ones who blew up Madrid or London or whatever. And the first thing that's important to understand is that this sort of popular notion of a clash of civilizations, which, by the way, our own politicians as well as the jihadis buy into between Islam and the West, is just wrong. I mean, violent extremism represents not the resurgence of sort of traditional territorial cultures and millennial civilizations, but their collapse. As young people, they're unmoored from these traditions. They flail about. It's sort of the dark side of globalization. They're flailing about in search of social identity that gives personal significance. And, this is accompanied for the first time in human history by a massive media-driven political awakening that's occurred, spurred by the internet, the social media, and cable television, which on the one hand could motivate universal respect for human rights, but on the other enabled Muslims from Borneo or Sulawesi, where I've worked, these are islands between Malaysia and Guinea, to sacrifice themselves for Palestine, Afghanistan, or Chechnya, despite the fact that there's been no shared history between these people for the last 50,000 years. So it's when this, so they're hooking up on the internet. It's a little bit like the New Yorker cartoon, there's the dog on the internet, and he's looking down at another little dog, and he goes, shh. Nobody knows we're dogs on the internet. Because once you're on the internet, you can narrow down your range of information, which is with these peers. It's no longer from elders. It's no longer from traditional sources of authority. It's no longer vertical. It's horizontal over the world, but in a very, very narrow band. And you hone in on this perceived injustice against Muslims. It's rather superficial. I mean, how else could you get guys who are literally cannibals 2 generations ago to sacrifice themselves for Palestine, for God's sakes? And when this perceived global injustice, and there is injustice, resonates with frustrated personal ambitions, then moral outrage gives universal meaning and push to this radicalization and violence. And, there is, I was on a conference call with the imams of Australia a couple of days ago, and they asked me, well, does the United States have any role in the creation of all this? And of course it does. But most of it is more, I think, inadvertent than purposeful. And I mean it by this sense. First of all, there's this idea that American politics is conspiratorial. People like conspiracy theories. I know politicians. You probably know politicians. They're like ordinary people. They get up in the morning, they eat breakfast, they look at the newspapers or go on the internet, and they say, God, the world's falling apart. What the hell am I supposed to do? And they go into their own personal networks to figure out something. Not that there's a conspiracy, but they follow the paths that are grooved for them, like ants, sort of in following pheromones in their own social networks. And then the United States has this problem, and that is that after World War II, they became the dominant power in the world, sucking in all their resources, military forces around the entire world. The Cold War, of course, stimulated it and spurred it. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, what you've got is the United States as the perceived representative and self-perceived representative of what George W. Bush called in his national security doctrine, preface to the national security doctrine after 9/11, the only ideology right and true for every person in every society is democratic liberalism. Okay, we're a salvational ideology, like all the isms. In fact, since universal religions grew up and were secularized in the French Revolution, all the isms that are derivative of the French Revolution, fascism, communism, colonialism, socialism, whatever you want, and they're all salvational, quasi-religious ideologies. Now, there are always recalcitrant people. There are always this driftwood of globalization, the dark side of globalization that I'm talking about, who have been left out, who don't want to be a part of it. So they're looking around, now that the Soviet Union and communism is no longer around, for something not only to give them personal significance, but to give them a role in the world. And that's why you get many disaffected people involved in this. And the jihad is unbelievably empowering. I mean, think about it. Basically, it says, you too can change the history of the world, can upset the mightiest power in the history of the world with a box cutter, or a pipe bomb, or a backpack. I mean, think about that. I mean, that is glorious. And, young men especially That's what they're after. I mean, Darwin was right. That's what young men are about, and that's what makes insurgents and revolutionaries or terrorists so successful. The passion, on the one hand, and the commitment, the commitment to one another. And that's what makes them so usually more successful in the long run, if they can hook up with one another, than traditional armies and police, which function on typical reward structures like pay and promotion.
Well, so on the question of, I mean, are there things the United States can do to drain some of the power from the narrative that they find appealing? I mean,
sure they can, but they haven't been interested in it. The reaction has been one of blunt force. I don't know. I told you last time. I'm at the White House presenting all this stuff of these networks and who these guys are. And Cheney's staff is there, and one young woman says to me, "Don't these young people understand we're going to have to kill them and bomb them?" I was flabbergasted, and I asked her to repeat that. And I said, "What, are you kidding? We're going to bomb London? We're going to bomb Morocco?" So I next time I went to the National Security Council at the White House, I brought comic books. One of them was the 99. 99 was developed by a Kuwaiti who got his degree from Columbia and now publishes it around the world. There's going to be films. There's a syndicated TV series. It's really interesting. 99 represents the 99 faces of Allah, of God. And there are these young people all over the world, some poor, some rich. They don't know they have the power to find one of the gemstones in the world that represents one of the faces of Allah. And they sort of have their adventures, and they inadvertently hook up with one another at the beginning. And each time they hook up with another one, their combined power for the good grows. And in the comic book, it's UNESCO or UNICEF versus jihad or things like that. And it's really quite entertaining and involving. When I hear people, first I hear things like, "Okay, we're gonna preach true Islam and moderate Islam." Now you've studied religion too, and you know that there is no such thing as the true anything in religion. These are open-ended propositions that are interpreted even week to week in sermons in different ways. And that's what gives them their adaptive value. They're ineffable, they're unverifiable, they're unfalsifiable, and they depend on how people interpret them. I mean, there's no essence to Islam, good or bad, any more than there's Christianity. And
okay, so what can we do to make them not interpret them the way they're interpreting them?
Give them alternative narratives and role models.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, first you plug into what they're thinking about. I'll just give you one example. So I'm asked to evaluate a USAID project in Morocco on local governments where they're going to involve youth and women, right? Tens of millions of dollars. Most of this is corrupt. That is, it's given to these architects, urban architects and planners, and they rent property from the queen or her mother at extravagant rates. So most of the money either goes to overhead for the organizations getting the money from USAID, or from these professionals in sight who siphon off the rest. Very little actually gets into the communities or into the programs. But one of them was to build youth houses so that young people can gather and talk and do good things. So, USAID gives me this evaluation metric where I'm supposed to say how many youth houses are successfully built in each community. I'm saying, that's your evaluation metric? Don't you want to know what's going on inside the youth houses? No, that's our metric for whether the grants are going to be. So I decided on my own to go visit the youth houses, right, the Dar al-Shabab. And what I found in them is that these kids, semi-literate kids from all, mostly poor neighborhoods, they're surfing jihadi sites. And they've invented this ersatz language they call Franglish, which is French and English and Spanish and Arabic. And they're also talking about jobs and girls and anything you can imagine, movies, anything you can imagine. And I realized, this could be a powerful tool. Get into this Franglish, figure out what these guys are, what their aspirations are, their heroes are, what they want in life, and offer them realistic possibilities in their idiom.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's the reaction of the local groups in the USAID? Shut it down.
Mm-hmm.
Just shut it down. And what are we going to do instead? We're gonna have imams come in and teach them moderate Islam. I mean, I said, haven't any of you have had teenage kids? I mean, when was moderate anything appealing to them?
Right.
I mean, they go in the opposite direction. Give them adventure. Give them glory. I'll just give you another anecdote. So I'm in Tetuan in a neighborhood called Jamamezwak, and 5 of the 7 guys who blew themselves up after the Spanish police caught them for blowing up the trains in Madrid grew up within 200 meters of one another in this one little neighborhood. So and then their cousins and friends many went to Iraq to blow themselves up, in Bakuba and elsewhere. So I'm in this place, and the kids are playing soccer in the garbage, literally, and I'm asking them, so what do you want to be in life? And they're like from 8 to 16 years old. And the first one says, I want to be an archaeologist. So I say, archaeologist, what do you want to find treasure? He says, no, I want to find out about our people, about our history. The second one, 8-year-old, says, I want to be a brain surgeon. Now, where do these kids get these ideas? But obviously these ideas, which come really from the West, are powerful for them. Mm-hmm. Then I ask them who their heroes are. So number 1 hero, Ronaldinho, a soccer player from the Barca team. By the way, Barca and Madrid are the 2 sports teams that are the most popular in the world, of course, and the world is basically divided, especially the Muslim world, between those 2 teams. Number 2 hero is the Terminator. No one knows he's related to the then governor of California. And number 3 is Bin Laden. But I go back a week after Obama's elected, and in the same neighborhood, not the same kids, but the same age groups, I asked who your heroes are. Number 1 hero is a guy named Eto'o, a Cameroonian striker for the Barca team, tied with a guy named Sergio Morales from the Madrid team. Number 2 is Terminator 2, believe it or not. And number 3, just beating out Bin Laden, is Obama. So what is it telling you about these kids? The same ones, they come from the same elementary school and the same high schools, same neighborhood that produced the suicide bomber, the bombers in Madrid and suicide bombers in Iraq. They're at a fork in their lives. They're young kids. They're looking for significance and meaning in life, right? You got this message. Yes, we can. Okay, Barack Obama seems to be the guy. And we got this other message. Happiness is martyrdom. Look at Bin Laden. He's changed the world. Which way are we going to go? Well, it actually turns out to depend upon who your buddies are that are going to pull you in one direction versus the other. So it's getting into these young people's networks.
That seems like kind of challenging because we're talking about people in America, like these guys, you never know who it's going to be, who's going to be the next one in America who's tempted by this. It's not like we have them in programs where we can feed stuff into their brains, right? I mean...
Right, but you don't want programs. Well,
what do you do? I don't understand.
You sensitize the population. You say to the entire, instead of saying to the population, be scared, hide, run into your doors, you sensitize them to look for when things that might be going bad among their friends, especially what are the sensitive populations. The way the Saudis, for example, figure out who's likely to go to jihad, and they're usually right, is the first thing they look at is who's not going to the mosque, right? Because everybody goes to the mosque in Saudi Arabia. And the guys who really don't go to the mosque, it's not because they're atheists, it's because they're opting out. They think the mosques are too moderate and they're going for jihad. So you look for these. Who's cutting their ties with their friends? Why are they cutting their ties? Who's complaining about the world? And, the way the NYPD does it well, but the way our other law enforcement does it and the way our intel establishment thinks about it, I think is all wrong. Basically, they say, okay, we find out who might be these guys and we stomp on them before they can do anything, which is why all these entrapment cases are occurring.
I actually think in mosques there is a certain amount of sensitivity to this. I mean, apparently this thing that was broken up in Canada just within the last week, where these guys were supposedly going to derail some train, apparently they were alerted to this by an imam, I think, who kept an eye, as I understand it. So, and I think, I mean, of course, if the guys aren't going to mosque in the first place, it's, you know, hard for them to be on the imam's radar screen. But if it's a case of them kind of, you know, dropping out of the mosque, whatever, I guess there's a chance. I still think intervention is dicey. It's still not clear to me what you would have done, you know, with these.
Well, take the FBI, take this young man, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who goes to Dagestan to visit his father,
right?
Where he's already sort of starting to drop out of you know, his boxing competition. He's starting to look for some different course in life. And then he goes to Dagestan, and he could or may have hooked up with some radical group, which is usually the case. You know, they'll give them some motivation, maybe even a little instruction how to pack a bomb and push a plunger or shoot a gun. And then basically they tell them, go home and do something like blow up, like the DC sniper did, cause havoc, and let the Americans terrorize themselves. Okay, so he comes back, and the Russians alert the FBI to the fact that this guy has been there. He's probably met some unsavory characters. And what does the FBI? They interrogate him and say whether he meets the criteria of evaluation for a threat or not a threat. Well, that's not the way to go about it. The way to go about it is, and you know, actually the Israeli police and even the Turkish police are pretty good at this for would-be jihadis, not for PKK, but of course I've seen them at work. They basically go to the family and they say, look, your son's been to Afghanistan or Chechnya or Pakistan, right? Okay, we really don't even want to know, you know, where he's been and who he knows and all that. That's not so important. We just don't want him. We don't want trouble, and we don't want him to cause trouble. And let's think about what we can do to stop it. Mm-hmm. And they build a relationship, you know, a human relationship with the family. And now you say, well, this is difficult, or are we going to do this with all the problems, cases?
Yeah, that is what I'd say.
Well, yeah. Well, yes, you can start doing it. There are ways of pulling the thread. We can put our resources on researching it, figuring out where there really are dangers, where along the pathway, and it's a pathway to violence and radicalization, it becomes dangerous or not, where we can intervene, not just when it's finally come to the place where exploded, we stamp down and cause mass hysteria in everybody. And then you say, well, this might be expensive, it's labor intensive. Well, let me tell you, it'd be an order of magnitude less expensive and labor intensive than what we're doing now.
Well, I guess what I would say is like, okay, maybe interviewing the guy wasn't the optimal thing, but I don't think there's any way they could have sensed at that point that this was the guy who was going to do some bombing, you know?
But again, you don't have to.
Well, yeah, but if you're going to try to intervene in the life of every young American Muslim who has a 1 in 1,000 chance of being that guy, that I would say expense is the least of your problems. It's just going to seem so intrusive and heavy-handed and oppressive that it's probably going to do more damage than good.
No, do exactly what you just pointed out to in Canada, and that is being done in New York City. Sensitize the community to monitor themselves. Well, and that's usually successful. That, in fact, is why we've had so few attacks and even attempted attacks. Because the community monitors itself. But we can do more to help. Mm-hmm. And that is, interviews are fine. They just can't be the kind of interviews that say, again, okay, either you're a criminal or you're not a criminal. Either we're going to stomp you or not.
Are you planning a bombing in the near future?
Remember, it's a pathway to violence. And, you know, we actually do fMRIs, believe it or not, where we show that the way people are processing the values that they're associating with this, with the jihad, or even their religion, belief in God. If when they lock into them, and we have all sorts of ways of testing it, whether they're, we have these auctions, whether they're willing to accept money to sign away or disavow their values, we find that it shifts in the brain actually from where you process preferences and sort of cost-benefit analysis to where you process rules, duties and obligations, in this case the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and that people who apparently violate the rules, once they get processed as rules, then the amygdala fires and people become all emotional. So there's a place in there, and you can do it through behavioral experiments. Of course, I've been much more replicated to a much greater degree, where people lock into their values, and it becomes really, very difficult to pull them out. Okay, they hunker down, they're in the cocoon, and there's really not much you can do except break the cocoon. But the whole path that leads to that is a long path where these reactions are very labile. And again, our law enforcement and our intelligence is not built to deal with it. Our law enforcement is built to deal with criminals, right? People who perform acts or who are about to perform acts. But that's not the way this is happening. It is, when we look at this over a 10-year period, we find that it has a long natural history where it's an organized anarchy. People are coming in and out of the network. The goals constantly shifting. The boundaries of inclusion are constantly, the means are constantly shifting. And it's almost like a game of musical chairs, so that when there is an actual attack, then it's almost an arbitrary moment in this social happening. And instead of looking at this whole network in which these things are taking place, people hunker down on just who happened to have, had the goods, provided logistical support, carried out the attack, had some material involvement in the thing, and let the friends and the family and the fellow travelers go by the by, when that's precisely not what to do. And the way we've actually dealt with the cases themselves, again, they're mostly, unlike in Europe, entrapment cases. Instead of the FBI and the police coming in and saying to these guys, look, you're on the wrong path here, and you're going to have problems, we're going to have problems, your family's going to have problems, your communities are going to have problems, let's work together to avoid this. And maybe you'll get one or two real nuts who will go off, or really guys already too far gone who will go off despite this. But in most cases, rather than entrap these guys, because it's a path that over time they could have gotten them away from violence. But the demand of the public and our politicians on our law enforcement is show us you can catch these guys, not show us you can stop this phenomenon.
Well, yeah, because for one thing, you never know when you have stopped them. It's even if you have, you can never prove that you did, so you don't get any glory for that. Let me just, and we have time for maybe one more question. Let me change the subject a little. Somebody on Twitter recently tweeted a link to an exchange I actually had kind of forgotten that you and I had last time. It was a link to a part of our conversation that was featured in the New York Times, and it was a part of our last conversation that I didn't really recall clearly. But basically, I think I'm being fair in saying we were both kind of skeptical of drone strikes, and you were certainly, I think, against what you would call promiscuous drone strikes, and maybe somewhat for the same reason that I am. In fact, I just wrote a piece a couple days ago for the Atlantic in the wake of this last bombing, arguing that drone strikes, they don't stop this kind of terrorism because it doesn't emanate from abroad, and if anything, they feed it because they feed the narrative. The civilian casualties from drone strikes feed the narrative that it's America against Islam. But I think where you and I disagreed was you saw some virtue in high-value targets, in particular al-Awlaki, on the American citizen who was assassinated in Yemen, and I was making the argument that, okay, he's very charismatic and he may seem very valuable to the jihadi movement, but if he dies, they'll just find some other charismatic imam on YouTube somewhere. And I think my side of the argument is kind of borne out by this last event because, okay, al-Awlaki wasn't around, but they found other guys. They found this Australian imam on YouTube, and they find their preachers once they're sufficiently disaffected to be looking for them. But you probably disagree, and also tell me if I've mischaracterized your view.
Well, a bit. I mean, al-Awlaki was a really problematic case because he did exactly what you did. You said he was. He was a charismatic leader who attracted these guys. But he also, and this is the difference, he also appeared to be involved in operational planning, and that's the big difference. I certainly agree with you. I mean, if you look at Major Hassan, for example, or Faiz Shahzad, the fizzle bomber in Times Square back in 2009 or 10, and Umar Abdul Muttalib, the young man from Nigeria who tried to blow up a plane in Detroit at Christmas Day, they were all inspired by al-Awlaki. But if you look at the email messages, so Hassan sends 21 email messages to al-Awlaki. Al-Awlaki sends them back 2, basically saying, go in the way of jihad, my son, without any operational anything. And then Major Hassan goes on his own. We find the Inspire magazine basically says to guys who may have looked at Inspire magazine probably, and that's where they got the idea of a pressure cooker bomb, says, look, stay home. If you come here, you're likely to get caught. I mean, in Yemen, you're likely to get us caught. So do something there. Here's some ideas. Now, I do agree that just because they're giving them ideas, you cannot kill them. I mean, take William Pierce, who I happen to know, actually, and I actually joined the Aryan Nations for a while in order to find out about him. The guy who inspired Timothy McVeigh and wrote the Turner Diaries, right? He definitely inspired McVeigh. I mean, his view of the world and his incitement to violence was certainly equal to al-Awlaki's. But, he's interviewed by Mike Wallace. He does anything he wants. He's free as a bird in the United States. Should we use a drone to kill a guy? Well, certainly not. And if we use a drone to kill someone, an American citizen elsewhere for that kind of thing, then of course we should have done it to Pierce or someone like that. But I don't think we should. But if they're involved in operational planning, that is, in actual attacks, well, I think that's a different story. And then a drone is just a weapon that I think is much less costly in terms of casualties to the United States itself than other weapons. But I certainly agree with you. I think that these preachers, these imams, these inspirers, Al-Qaeda was never so much, they were never a recruiting agency. They were always like the NSF or the NIH. You applied to them for assistance. Sometimes they took it, sometimes they not. You proposed plots to them, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed did for the 9/11 thing. But what they are is they are attractors. And they attract disaffected individuals who have already decided to embark on a path to violent extremism with the help of family, friends, or a few fellow travelers. And you're right. There are always going to be these attractors out there. Just one more anecdote. I'm interviewing this guy, and a French prisoner wants to blow up the American embassy. And I ask him, so why did you want to do this? And he gives me his whole spiel about the persecution of Muslims around the world. I said, yeah, but why did you want to do it? He says, I'm walking down the street with my sister on the Boulevard de la République in Paris, and she's window shopping. She wears a hijab, and she bumps into this elderly gentleman. The gentleman, yells at her, spits at her, and goes, Sal Arab, you dirty Arab. And he said, that convinced me that there was no hope and jihad was the only way.
Yeah.
And I said to him, but there's always been that racism. And he said, yes, but the jihad didn't exist then. So it's an attractor out there. And it will be for all these people, these disaffected individuals with frustrated personal aspirations. And that narrative isn't going to go away by itself. There has to be a competing narrative. So offer it in terms of real heroes, action heroes, not the kinds of crackpot programs and moderation programs and governance programs and youth house programs concocted in Washington. And then it's labor intensive, but work with the communities in the networks and support from the bottom up those initiatives that come from the communities and these kids themselves. And that's not what we're doing at all.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for sharing the fruits of all your experience. And I encourage people to go read your piece that we talked about at the outset about how the media is kind of not serving the national interest in their coverage of the Boston bombing. And I hope you'll come back to talk to us again, although I hope there isn't an occasion like this one for that anytime soon.
Well, we can talk. We can
always talk.
Other things.
Okay, so thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.